I'm Brian DeVault, CTO of Netrio.
Mike Cromwell, partner and evangelist with Netrio. Regardless of whether it's a simple project that you're deploying or a super complex one, that there's some commonality and specifically 8 key tenets or components of a really good project management plan.
All right, so the first tenet of good project management is project initiation. We want to establish what our overall goals are. So the next piece of it we're going to want to establish is the scope of the project. What all is included in this project from start to finish, right? So if we think about, in some cases, these are assets. In some cases, this is, technology in general. In some cases, it might be subscriptions to internet service provider circuits. One of the other items that we're going to include, deliverables. So sometimes these can be considered like outcomes. Say I'm merging 2 enterprise networks into one. My deliverable will be a single functional network that was previously 2 separate or segregated networks. The next item we'll talk about is roles and responsibilities. You may not have named people you can put on those. You just know you need a resource to do X or Y. So the next thing we're going to want to define is initial project schedule. And essentially what you're doing here is you're putting some kind of loose start and end dates around it, but based on the complexity of the project, based on the client's preparedness for the transition, based on the amount of documentation available, based on the condition of the environment, all those things are going to have some impact, but that impact is only going to expand our scope by a couple of weeks. So the next thing we want to talk about is the project charter. So what a charter does is defines why. It's about summarizing the why.
Now we're going into the second part. So walk us through the components of planning the project and why that's important as a foundational part of the project management plan.
So like you said, after the project initiation, we're going to go into the phase where we're planning the project. And so I've got some steps up here that we've written down that talks through how we handle the process. So the first step in planning the project is refining the scope. So this is where we're really digging into the details. We're having detail-oriented conversations with the client about what the project is set out to accomplish. We're talking numbers of devices, assets, people, technology, whether that's software as a service or on-premise technology. All of those things are being defined. We're moving on to team selection. And here we're not just talking about resources like an engineer here or a design build architect here. What we're talking about are named resources. So we're assigning names into the pool. These are the specific people we're going to use during the duration of the project. And we talk about resourcing. Okay, so this is who, how many, when and where, right? What are the people we're going to need? What are the materials we're going to need? Are there dependencies such as hardware being delivered? Looking at the project budget. So we're putting another level of detail in. So we had a budget established during project initiation. Now we're really putting some detail behind that and then going into a detailed timeline. So now we're putting dates down. It says we're going to be finished with the first set of tasks on Wednesday and then the next set on Friday. And we're really getting that schedule dialed into a day-by-day granular basis. We're starting to conduct some risk analysis. So as we drive the detail into that project, it's going to allow us to see, okay, we've got a lot going on in week 2 and going into week 3. So we know there's inherently more risk involved there. And then finally putting that quality assurance plan in place. So things like performance to budget reports, performance to timeline reports. Those are examples of QA activities. So once the project starts, we're managing people largely. And so we're doing things like schedule performance. So we're looking at it on a daily basis to say, here's what we plan to have done by this point in time, and here's what we've actually gotten done. You're conducting weekly meetings, maybe even bi-weekly, depending on how frequently you need to communicate with the project team. And then we're providing status updates to project sponsors and to the project team. When we say resources, the first thing we think about is people, and that's certainly one aspect of it. But it could be systems, it could be processes, it could be facilities. We're reviewing our performance to date, and we're determining if we have an adequate amount of resources in order to finish the project on time and on budget. Really when we start to measure activity against the project, we're talking about, what's the level of activity that's being done, right? So see, in the middle of a project, the activity level is going to be very high, right? And the level of engagement, the number of people that are involved is going to be very high. And in that case, we're looking at performance to budget because those people have an hourly cost, right? In some cases, that's something we're trying to manage against, right? But we also want to look at performance to schedule. As you and I've talked about a lot, the difference between importance and urgency comes into play here a lot. So our performance to schedule may be more important than our performance to budget. And really what we're talking about is adding, removing, or changing, people, process, or assets involved in that resource pool. So, but one of the things you want to make sure that you do as part of your project planning is set a schedule up front for what documentation you're going to produce, who it's going to, and at what frequency you're going to produce it. This kind of sets the stage and sets everyone's expectation for what they should receive throughout the course of the project execution. An example is a project plan, right? An example is a performance report. We talked last episode about performance to budget versus performance to schedule, right? So those can be different things. It should be template based. So any of these documents that you produce should be based on a template so that they're standardized. And then producing the meeting status report. Anytime you hold a meeting when you're conducting a project or executing a project, you have notes and deliverables and changes and discussion points that come out of those project meetings. And if you're not memorializing those in a status report of some type, they basically didn't happen. In depth about risk management, there's a lot of different ways and a lot that goes into risk management. Each task has a dependency. So in a lot of times you have to perform them in order. And if you have a task that is falling behind schedule, then that introduces risk for the tasks that are subsequent, right? And so that's where you have to kind of measure the risk and then add, remove, or adjust resourcing. But obviously, sometimes you have to adjust your timeline. Also, when risk is introduced, just so you're meeting expectations of all the stakeholders, and that you can finish on time. And then also, you've got your budget can be in jeopardy. And so, by applying resource leveling, by applying communication, by applying some of our previously discussed tenets of project management, you inherently can reduce the risk associated with not completing on time or not completing on budget or not meeting expectations. The formal methods of communications, the PSRs, project status reports, PPs, project plans, Gantt charts, those things are absolutely critical to keeping the project on schedule, on budget, and successful. And so they have to exist in any successful project management program. And so, I find myself having a lot of informal conversations as well, verbal conversations, even text. We interact as a team sometime with text threads, but definitely stick to your formal reports and the schedule that you defined up front. Create those standards in the form of templates, right? So they're reusable products that you could, that people understand how to consume and digest. And then obviously, this stuff is going to be reusable in our next phase, which is turnover to long-term support. And so we want to make sure that any documentation we're producing as we're design building architecture, it's kind of like a house. You start with a blueprint, and then the blueprint becomes your reference once the house is built. All right, so basically this is the part where we're transitioning from the project team to the operations team, or the people that are actually going to deliver the service, right? So from a project perspective, we've got to make sure that we get a few things established. So we got to make sure, number one, that the client knows how to request support. What is that process like? Is it web-based? Is it email-based? Is it telephone-based? Is it all the above? They need to know all of those things. So the date has to coincide with the communication about how to request support, right? So if you're sending out a company-wide communication or distribution that says, hey, on Friday at 5 o'clock, we're going to transition to a new support organization. Here's how you contact them, right? Makes sense? So one of the other things we're going to want to do is review our weekly and monthly meeting requirements. So who's going to continue to meet once we enter into long-term support, and what's that frequency? So we're definitely going to want to review the long-term reporting requirements. So anything like performance to SLA reports, anything that's automatically produced, we're going to want to establish that, figure out who's going to receive that from the client's perspective. And then we're going to want to review any regularly occurring procedures. So anything that happens frequently, like onboardings and offboardings of end users is a good example of that.